The town of Stillwater was a place of quiet surrender. It wasn't on the way to anywhere else. Its Victorian houses, once proud, now sagged under the weight of old rain and older memories. The air, thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, carried a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. For Elara Vance, returning after 15 years, it was a return to a tomb she'd fought her whole adult life to escape. She'd come back for her grandmother, Agnes. The call from old Sheriff Miller had been brief, his voice a gravelly echo from her childhood. "It's your grandmother, Elara. She's slipped. The house, it's not good. You're her only kin." The house was worse than not good. Whisperwood, the grandiose name now a cruel joke, stood at the end of a choked private lane. Its gables were skeletal fingers clawing at a perpetually gray sky. Paint peeled away in long, brittle strips, and the wraparound porch groaned a warning under her weight. Inside, the smell was the first assault. Not just dust and mildew, but something sweetly organic, like overripe fruit and wet soil. The second assault was the sound, or rather the lack of it. The house seemed to swallow noise, creating a vacuum of silence that made the blood pound in her ears. Agnes was in the parlor, seated in a high-backed velvet chair that had been devoured by moths. She was a wisp of the formidable woman Elara remembered, her skin papery and translucent, her eyes milky with cataracts. But she was lucid. "Elara," she whispered, her voice the sound of dry leaves skittering across pavement. "You shouldn't have come back. The house is hungry." "It's okay, Grandma. I'm here to take care of you." Elara's words felt hollow, eaten by the oppressive quiet. Agnes's hand, cold and brittle as a bird's claw, grasped hers. "It's not me who needs taking care of. It's the house. It needs a new listener." That first night, Elara learned what she meant. Lying in her childhood bedroom, the door locked against the creeping dread, she heard it. A whisper. It was so faint she thought it was the wind sighing through the rotten window frame, but the night was still. She held her breath. Elara. It was her name. A sigh, a breath, a nothing. She sat bolt upright, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Silence. She told herself it was the house settling, her own exhaustion, the stress of homecoming. She got up, her feet cold on the bare wooden floor, and went to the window. The moon, a sliver of bone, offered little light. The woods behind the house were a wall of impenetrable black. "Stay!" She spun around. The whisper had come from right behind her. The room was empty. A cold dread, sharper than any fear she'd ever known, began to prick at her skin. This was the feeling she'd spent her life running from. The feeling that had driven her, a terrified 17-year-old, to flee Stillwater in the middle of the night with nothing but a backpack. The whispers became her constant companions. They were never loud, never clear sentences. They were fragments, echoes of thought, sometimes in her grandmother's voice, sometimes in her mother's, long dead, a wasting sickness, the town had said, and sometimes in voices she didn't recognize. They murmured about the weather, about old regrets, about the damp in the walls. They were boring, mundane, and utterly terrifying in their pervasive intimacy. They were the house thinking aloud, and it was thinking about her. She tried to clean, to impose order on the decay, but the house resisted. Drawers she'd empty would be full again hours later. Objects, a tarnished silver hairbrush, a child's porcelain doll, would appear in places she'd just cleared. The house was not just a structure, it was a living, rearranging entity, and it was studying her. One afternoon, while trying to air out the library, she found a hidden panel behind a collapsed bookshelf. Inside was a single, leather-bound journal, its pages brittle and foxed. It belonged to her great-great-grandmother, Cora Vance. The entries were not dated. "The soil here is different," one entry read. It listens. "Silas says I'm mad, but he doesn't hear it. He just digs his foundations and plants his roses. But the roses have thorns that bite like teeth, and the foundation is laid on something that sleeps." Another entry, written in a shakier hand. "The whispers started today. Silas says it's the wind in the eaves. It is not the wind. It knows my name. It asks for things. The final entry was a single, desperate sentence, scrawled across an entire page. It wants a voice. It wants a voice. It wants a voice. Elara dropped the journal as if it had burned her. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. This was her inheritance. This was her family's legacy. Not a house, but a parasite. A listener in the soil that had latched onto her bloodline, using their homes, their very lives, as a conduit to what? That night, the whispers changed. They were no longer fragmented thoughts. They coalesced, grew stronger, more insistent. They came from the walls, the floorboards, the very air. Elara Vance, they hissed, a chorus of dry, ancient voices. You are home. You are the listener now. You will give us voice. She ran to her grandmother's room. The old woman was awake, her milky eyes wide with terror. It's time, Agnes rasped. It's tired of just listening. It's been practicing with us for 100 years. It wants to speak. What is it? Elara cried, gripping the old woman's thin shoulders. The thing under the foundation, Agnes whispered. The thing in the soil, the oldest listener. We built our silence on its hunger. A crash came from downstairs. The front door had blown open. But there was no wind. The whispers grew to a deafening roar, a cyclone of stolen thoughts and hungry intent. They were no longer just sounds. They were a pressure, pushing in on her, trying to get inside. Elara did the only thing she could think of. She screamed. She poured every ounce of her fear, her rage, her 15 years of fought for freedom into a raw, primal scream that tore at her throat. And for a single miraculous second, the whispers stopped. The house held its breath. Then they laughed. It was a sound of dry bones rattling, of roots grinding against stone. Her scream was nothing to them. It was just another noise for them to consume. Good, the chorus hissed. Good. More. She felt it then, a coldness seeping up from the floorboards, entering through the soles of her feet. It was a vast, ancient consciousness, and it was pouring itself into her. She was not being haunted. She was being hollowed out. Prepared. She stumbled back, away from her grandmother's pleading eyes, away from the thing flooding into her. She fell against the wall, and her hand brushed against a heavy iron candlestick. Without thinking, she swung it with all her might at the ancient, dry wall. The plaster exploded inward, not into lathe and insulation, but into a fibrous, pulsing network of black roots that throbbed with a sickly light. They writhed like worms, and from the rupture the whisper voice screamed, a sound of pure, agonized fury. The house could be hurt. Elara didn't hesitate. She ran, not for the door, but for the kitchen, for the fireplace, for the old wood-burning stove. She grabbed a book of matches. The whispers were a panicked shriek now. Stop! You are ours! The listener becomes the voice. She didn't listen. She struck a match and touched it to a curtain. The dry fabric went up like a torch. She threw the match into a pile of old newspapers, then another onto the moth-eaten drapes of the parlor. The house began to burn, and as it burned, it screamed. Not with fire, but with 100 stolen voices, all crying out in terror and pain at once. Elara ran out into the cold, clean air, collapsing on the dead lawn as Whisperwood became a pyre against the night sky. She watched it burn, the heat blistering on her face, the screams dying away one by one until there was only the crackle of flame and the crash of timbers. She was free. The state provided a temporary rental, a small, sterile apartment on the other side of Stillwater, as far from the woods as one could get. The town, of course, talked. They called it a tragedy, a shame about the historic house. Some, the older ones, looked at Elara with a new, wary respect in their eyes. They knew. They'd always known. For 2 weeks, she existed in a state of numb shock. She attended her grandmother's funeral. Agnes had passed in her sleep the night of the fire, a small mercy, and arranged for the lot where Whisperwood had stood to be sold for pennies. She wanted nothing to do with it. She slept with the lights on. The silence of the apartment was a blessing, a void she cherished. She began to think she might be okay. The thing in the soil had been starved, its conduit to the world of sound burned to ash. Then, the dream started. She was standing in a vast, dark space. Underfoot was not ground, but a dense, fibrous mat that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat. Lub-dub, lub-dub. In the distance, she could hear them, the whispers, but they were faint, muffled, desperate. They were trapped, and she could feel it. A presence, vast, patient, and deeply, deeply angry. It had been listening for a very long time, and it had learned the one thing it truly needed to know: how to want. She'd wake up gasping, her ears straining against the perfect silence of her apartment, terrified of what she might hear. But there was nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car. Normal sounds, human sounds. The days began to twist. Small things at first. She'd be in the grocery store reaching for a can of soup, and she'd hear a clear, distinct whisper from the next aisle over, "Rotten, all of them rotten." She'd peer around the corner to find an old man sniffing a melon, his lips not moving. Walking by the park, the rustle of leaves in the breeze would coalesce into a sigh. She doesn't belong here. Never did. She started wearing headphones, playing loud, abrasive music to block it all out. But the whispers began to slip underneath the noise, not in her ears, but directly into her mind. "You can't silence us," they murmured. "The listener is listened to. The ear cannot close." She was sitting in her apartment, trying to read, when the faucet in the kitchen dripped. Plink. It was a normal sound, but then another. Plink. And another. Plink. They began to fall into a rhythm, matching the beat of her own heart. Lub-dub. Plink. Lub-dub. Plink. Then the drip changed. It wasn't a plink anymore. It was a voice. Elara.